Hi, I'm F. Ball Driscoll. I'm here for another episode of Sightlines, and my very special guests this evening are Phil Chan and Georgina Pazcoguin, who are the founders of Final Bow for Yellowface. Uh, there's a book which has been published this year, and that's available at independent booksellers and at online retailers everywhere. I recommend it highly. It's a wonderful read. But I'd now like to talk to them about how they came to start this project and how it is continuing. So welcome, Phil and Georgina.
Thank you for having us.
So Georgina, if I could start with you, you're a soloist with New York City Ballet, and you've obviously danced in their production of The Nutcracker, and you've also operated as a dancer on Broadway. You were in the revival of On the Town and in the revival of Cats. So when you joined City Ballet as a dancer, what was your experience coming into that company as an Asian American woman, looking at the way Asians were portrayed on stage?
I think I did not, I mean, I know, I don't have to think. I know I did not have the clarity of person to understand what I was experiencing. I
Mm-hmm.
knew I had reached this pinnacle of a goal and a dream, and it was wonderful to be part of the New York City Ballet as an apprentice. And then to get my core contract, those are markers in a dancer's career.
Mm-hmm.
And one has to be so singularly focused that it doesn't always resonate what's shadowed in that path. And I first clocked that I knew I was quote unquote other when I first came to School of American Ballet. There was no one else that, like looked like me. And then when I got into the company, the ballerina of color that I looked up to was Aisha Ash.
Mm-hmm.
And but I still wasn't able to make the connections between her, and as she started to graduate out of things, all of a sudden I was put in her spot in corps de ballets. I didn't know that those were conscious choices on another person's part, and I think it was a gradual realization that, oh, I don't quote unquote fit in because for more than what my outrageous personality is.
So I'd like to bring Phil into this at this point. Phil, you have a dance background, but you also are a writer and an editor. And you're looking at this, or began to look at this from what I understand from the book, in a slightly more objective way, because you're looking at the Nutcracker rather than being in the Nutcracker. Am I correct in this?
Correct. Yeah. I have, of course, danced many different productions of Nutcracker, and done actually almost all of the parts except for Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
So coming from both as an educator, as an advocate, but also as a former dancer, it really gave me a very nuanced perspective. On one hand, I actually hate to admit this, but I think the Nutcracker might be one of my favorite ballets. Just not necessarily because of what the choreography is, but I think sort of a bigger thing of what it actually stands for and the sort of place it has in the hearts of many people. It's sort of like our Wizard of Oz. It just is.
Uh-huh.
It's just is magic. And I just remember the first time performing. When you're performing the Nutcracker, it's always someone's first time seeing it. So it's sort of like seeing ballet. So it's always a very special experience to dance in the Nutcracker. So that really reinforced how high the stakes were for me around this classical work. And so to hear that, there's this struggle between trying to conserve history and keep things as is, but also without alienating people of color. I'm sort of straddling between both worlds as both a person of color and someone who loves the Nutcracker. So I think it was from that approach that a lot of our advocacy stemmed from. And I know Gina feels the same way, having this sort of love-hate relationship with the Nutcracker. You know, we say, oh, it's so nice to not hear it playing in shopping malls, you know, this year, but also we do miss it. You know, it's an emotional cycle that happens every year. So yeah, I think that's why it's just so important to us.
So for those of our audience who don't quite understand the full historical perspective of the Nutcracker, the original production of the ballet is in 1892, but it didn't really become a Christmas staple as we know it now in the United States until George Balanchine's production. Am I correct? And which is 54?
So the Christensen brothers, who founded both San Francisco Ballet and Ballet West, they actually debuted the first production at San Francisco Ballet in 1944.
44, yeah.
Yeah, and the Christensen brothers really were inspired by Balanchine and Danilova, who were passing through San Francisco at the time. Danilova showed excerpts from the Mariinsky version she knew. But George Balanchine really, his advice was, hey, make your own thing, put your own stamp on this work. And that's a tradition that he took on when he premiered his Nutcracker, and has also inspired many other choreographers since then to reinterpret this classical ballet. You're right, it didn't have a particularly Christmas feeling when it premiered in Russia. It was sort of seen as a school children's ballet, you know, not really an adult dramatic work. But as an immigrant ballet, it's taken on a new meaning here in the United States. I mean, if you just look at what the ballet is about, it's about a young girl growing up and moving into a new world and discovering who she is. And it, you know, what could be a better allegory for what it means to be American, you know, and taking something from our old world and reinterpreting it and making it something beautiful and diverse for us, you know. So I think that's why the mystery of or the mystique of the Nutcracker remains to this day. Of course, you have the, you know, exceptional unparalleled music by Tchaikovsky, which also helps a lot. But yeah, I think there's a really strong emotional pull for many generations of Americans that has since spread around the world. You know, other companies are now doing Christmas Nutcrackers, but yes, I think it was really Balanchine who was one of the first to really anchor it around Christmas. And it was because of New York City Ballet's proximity to CBS television that allowed, you know, they were looking for Christmas entertainment. Here's New York City Ballet right down the street. So it seemed like a perfect marriage there. And, you know, beaming into American living rooms over the Christmas holiday just made it such a hallmark of the holiday that it's now become so intertwined with the holiday season that it's so hard to imagine without a year without Nutcracker this year. So,
I mean, just to jump into like tag on to what Phil said so wonderfully, eloquently, and the Nutcracker, it is in a less philosophical idea. It's a chance for people who might not be able to travel around the globe to travel around the globe in the second act. I mean, they can get a taste of the world. And I think that's what's so special about the Nutcracker. And it's funny that, you know, why we pushed back our meeting was I was doing Nutcracker all day today, really badly. But, you know, but I'm proud of myself that I could still pull it out after 8 months off. But the Nutcracker it's special. And I don't, and I've said this before in a different interview recently, I don't miss the stress of the season. I don't miss the sacrifice of missing out on family gatherings. Now, we all happen to be missing out on family gatherings because of a different phenomenon that's happening right now. But I think for Nutcracker, for me, it's so special in that it is this yearly tradition and it feels so right. Like I felt so satisfied to be doing the steps and hearing the music blasting through a studio. And that's the only Nutcracker I will probably do, but that's enough. And in that respect, as someone who does 48 Nutcrackers and has done 48 Nutcrackers, one is enough for me this year. I'll take it.
So Gina, can you talk about a couple of things. How did you and Phil meet? How did you conceive the idea for Final Bow for Yellowface? And are the two of you surprised at how effective your advocacy has been? Because when did you get together, and how did this develop into something which has really been a game changer for a lot of dance companies, and by extension, in my experience, some opera companies here in the US? So Gina, how did you meet?
Wow, that's wonderful to hear that it's spread to the opera community too. Um, Phil and I, we have there's a discrepancy. I swear I met Phil at a summer course. He only remembers meeting me at a gig that he produced in Pennsylvania, and that's where we really reconnected, and our friendship just blossomed. Um, and it was through this. Are we surprised about? We knew it was going to be a grassroots effort, and it came about. Findable came about as a result of discussions that were already happening internally at New York City Ballet, and I was on this diversity committee. And then I had brought up in a safe space, Peter, I'd really love to put you in touch with Phil. He's of Chinese descent. He knows exactly what needs to be done. He also loves ballet. And
This is Peter Martins you're
Peter
talking
Martin, sorry. Yes, Peter Martins, who was the director at the time. And Peter was like really receptive to it. And to his credit, I have to give him credit there. Like he was open. And so like I left the 5-hour meeting. I like flippantly called Phil and was like, you might get a call from Peter's assistant, I don't know, click. And then sure enough, he got a call that Peter wanted to meet with him. And that sort of started this catalyst in their conversation, which I'll let Phil fill you in on. It just was this, he called me afterwards and was like, Gina, I think we're going to impact change on George Balanchine's Nutcracker. And it just spurred, I think I did, what I love about Phil and I as a partnership is that we both always shoot the moon. And
about.
it immediately spurred the idea of like, if we can do it here at New York City Ballet, we can do it everywhere. And wouldn't it be great by like 2018 to have had all, major new ballet companies sign a pledge to be like, we're committed to change. And it wasn't a matter of like having the productions change, but then it just like it morphed, and it was like a domino effect. You tip one and then another and another, and it really was, for the longest time, Phil and I putting the slightest pressure on the friends that we have in the ballet world, and then it became a global phenomenon, which is awesome. I'll let Phil jump in because I know he has more to say.
And just kind of before Phil jumps in, I want to make it clear for our listening audience, the section of Nutcracker that we're talking about is relatively brief, but the implication of the way that was choreographed and danced for so many years is huge. It extended far beyond whatever it lasts, 5 or 6 minutes maybe. And I think what's interesting is the way people are looking at other ballets which are set in Asia or have Asian characters, and by extension, operas, which more than the theater anyway in the US, use Asian characters played by non-Asian singers. So Phil, talk about the conversation with Peter and what the specifics were that you thought needed to be changed.
Yeah, so we looked in that conversation with Peter Martins. We talked a lot about the history of how Asians have been represented on the stage in the performing arts, but also in movies, in film, in radio, political cartoons, and also the geopolitical events surrounding Asian Americans. So the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Second World War, Japanese internment, Vietnam War, Korean War, and what were the images of Asians in the popular culture through all of those times. And then in what way was the ballet world mirroring what was happening in society? So I'm actually working on my second book right now, which is a survey of Orientalism in ballet. So it's looking at about 100 different ballet works from 1700 to today that have this, take place in Asia, whether that's North African, Middle Eastern, South Asian, or East Asian, but just, those people over there. And that dynamic of having this Eurocentric gaze when we're looking at people from other places outside of Europe. And so because opera and ballet have this traditional conservative nature, I think ballet even much more so than opera, because with opera, you've got a score, you've got the written notes, so you can afford to take larger chances with opera. So you can set Così fan tutte at Coney Island, you could set Rigoletto at Rat Pack Las Vegas, and no one will bat an eye. Whereas you take a ballet like La Bayadere, which is set in exotic India. We're barely holding on to this ballet as it is. It's sort of this game of telephone where one ballerina passes the steps on to another one. So we're already like, it's disintegrating before our eyes. So there's this pressure to keep things as conservative as possible to maintain that tradition. The problem with that is, in the sake of tradition, we're basically presenting these works as if the Russian Tsar is still alive and who's paying for it. So when we come to America and we're saying, yes, diversity, equity, inclusion, we want more Black people in the audience, we want Asian people on our board, we want Latino students in our schools. Yet here is a worldview that we perpetuate that presents your culture the way the Russian people saw your culture 150 years ago, with all of the layers of colonial imbalance, would have colored that depiction. And then we're also seeing a lack of authentic Asian voices actually representing ourselves. So most people can't name a major Asian choreographer who's made work on a ballet company. I mean, how many Asian composers have premiered a work at the Metropolitan Opera House? My guess is zero, but you're the opera expert.
Adam is listening and wringing his hands and hoping that I'll come up with Tandem. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Adam.
So one out of all of the operas that the Metropolitan Opera regularly performs in repertory, one Asian composer ever. Yet we perform Turandot, we perform Butterfly. So it's like we have this imbalance of pretending that Asians still look like they did 150 years ago, yet we're still trying to make them included by getting them to join our board. And those two things are not congruent. So what we need to do is, I think when people say, oh, decolonizing the art form, that's a big, scary word. And all it means is basically taking the assumption that Europeanness is not at the center of this story. So what is left of opera or ballet when Europeanness is not the center of the story? So for example, in Nutcracker, how do you represent Chinese if it's not seen through the eyes of a Western person? How would a Chinese person deal with Chinese? And I think that's what we need to do if we're hoping that our work will resonate with a diverse audience. Because right now it's not. People of color come to, an outdated representation of themselves and they don't see a place for them. They see something that's lacking integrity, that doesn't reflect their experience or their culture. And so why would they want to participate? Why would they want to send their kids to the school or buy a subscription or even buy another ticket to see anything? So, we can't just say diversity, equity, inclusion, and look, we have Misty Copeland dancing as the slave girl in Corsair, and that's good enough. It doesn't cut it. You can't have the first Black principal dancer dancing a slave girl at America's national company with as a happy dancing slave. Like, we have to think a little bit deeper when we're reviving these classics.
And so I think Gina, jump in on that point, and to further clarify your question, it's, there's intersectionality to what our work is. Yes, we focused on the Nutcracker, and yes, we focused on this actual, it's about 30 seconds, the divertissement of Chinese. It's very, very short. But it opens the door to conversations about how we represent Middle Eastern culture, how we represent, all of the cultures in the second act, and then in La Bayadere, and then in Le Corsair. So it's kind of the gateway to this larger conversation, and it's something that means something to both Phil and I, because this is a ballet that is such a tradition in the United States, and it's what we take our children to. And it's, for a lot of people, a lot of children, their first look at foreign culture. And so Phil and I love to ask the question of, like, well, how can this be better if we're presenting this to our children and we want them to learn and be global citizens? Then we have to view this as a lens that's not just European, not just a white lens.
well, a white European lens from the 19th century specifically,
Correct.
because that's what's
Yep.
being perpetuated.
Right.
Can you touch a little bit on the issue of representation as a woman who comes from an Asian American background? Is that something that you feel is being addressed? The idea that more dancers of color. I saw that, I'm interrupting myself. I saw the series you did, What's the Tea, which is a series of conversations you did with dancers who were Asian or of Asian descent. And I thought it was fascinating how so many different people who had that label came at that question of what it was like for them with so many different answers that you fielded so well. So is it possible to rev up the representation of dancers of color?
First
Or
of
is it
all, before Gina answers, I do have to note that Gina is the first Asian American woman to ever be promoted out of the corps de ballet, ever. Under Balanchine, under Peter Martins, under John and Wendy now, she is the only Asian woman to ever make it out of the corps de ballet.
at,
At New York
New
City,
York City Ballet?
there are Asian American principal dancers with almost every other company in America. But for some reason, the school and the company at New York City Ballet, up until this point, have not produced Asian dancers before Gina. Just putting that out there before she answers, but giving you some context there.
Thank you. Gina?
So yes, I want to also further clarify that I am the first female. There have what's interesting is that it seems like there has always been a way to break the glass ceiling first for the male trajectory in terms of prowess in dancing, and there are many men that have stood before me in this platform. As a female, and to my experience, and are we doing enough work? As astonished as I think you were in listening to these people speak their stories, so were Phil and I. And I think what the biggest takeaway from that entire month of interviews was like, wow, I had no idea we had such a big community.
Yeah.
We have a wonderful community, and we just have, because I don't know if it's I don't think it's done on purpose, but through the nature of being on our teams in these different companies, much like a sports team, there's not any chance to interact with other dancers from other companies. And this melted away that institutional sort of bias, and it had us connect in ways, just in a human way, and to like what's it been, and there were so many parallels. And I must say that we had such interesting responses from people who were born and raised and studied in Asia, to those who were split multiracial Asian American, and those stories and those conversations, not to say that any other conversation was less than, those conversations struck my core to where most of the time I'm tearing up, because it was the same things that were being said to them were being said to me. And all of a sudden we're making these connections. And now we have this wonderful web of support and love and understanding and experience. And I think we are just starting to recognize the problem. So I can't all of a sudden say that, yes, we've solved it. I think in acknowledging the problem is the very first step. And I do think that many companies are at least acknowledging. And that's going to speak volumes, and also just for us as dancers to take some autonomy and start to speak out. That's something that has struck me more as an individual, that wow, I do have a story to share, and there are young students who see themselves in me when I didn't see myself in any other ballerina. And that's important to me, and that's something that I cherish. And I spend a lot of, like, there's an imposter syndrome to it, just because I'm bred to pick out what's wrong with my dancing, and so there's an inherent sort of mindset. And I didn't think that I was ready to be in this position, but now I can full-heartedly say that I can accept this and be an example. And I'm not the example. There's so many other women, and if there's something that like some young student comes to me that I can't answer, I have such an amazing web due to our work, Phil and I's work in interviewing all these dancers, that I can send them to the right place. And it's not that I don't share the weight alone. And that's been amazing to recognize that the weight of of this ceiling for me to break, we break it all together.
I have a question for Phil, because one of the phrases in the book I thought was beautifully turned. And you wrote, I'm just reading, you don't colonize ballet, ballet colonizes you. Can you explain that?
I mean, if you think about ballet as a practice, it's a method of training your body. It is putting your body through a physical pace that is unnatural. You know, it is highly unnatural to stand on your toes, to put the full weight of the human body on the, you know, less than half an inch of surface area on the tip of your toes is not natural. Um, the turning out of the legs, you know, from the hips to open your feet out to 180 degrees, the human body is not supposed to do that. It can, you know, but it's not supposed to do that. So it colonizes your physical body. It programs the way you think. You know, ever since a young age, in terms of gender, in terms of how you approach self-criticism, how you approach feedback, how you work with other people, how you collaborate, how you see yourself in the world, where your self-confidence stems from. I mean, so many things in a person's that you might take for granted as personality traits come from years of putting your left hand at the bar first thing every morning and doing it, and you're doing it, but it's also doing it to you, you know. It's psychological, it's physical, it's a way of life. I remember just when I was dancing professionally, like it dictates your sleeping schedule, your eating schedule, who your friends are, you know, what kind of a life, social life you can have. I mean, it's just, it takes over every aspect of your life from a very young age. And so, yeah, absolutely. Ballet colonizes you. You don't colonize ballet.
I want to thank you both for being with us, and also uh, to thank you both for making me think about this issue. One of the many books that I read during pandemic was this one. And it's things I didn't think about in detail before, if you know what I mean. It wasn't necessarily new information, it was a new perspective. And I think that that's important for all of us. But congratulations to you both. And your website is what?
Yellowface.org, www.yellowface.org.
Okay.
And right now we're in the middle of producing a holiday treat for everybody called Mystery Nutcracker Theater. Essentially, Gina and I both really are missing Nutcracker. And so we were able to get permission to use a 1984 archival version of Ballet West's Nutcracker, which is the Christensen brother version, the same one that's been performed continuously since 1944 in San Francisco. And we're also thrilled to be partnering with Chinese Theater Works, which is a Chinese shadow puppet theater troupe here in New York City. And we're basically overlaying Chinese shadow puppets over an old Nutcracker video. And it's as if, you know, two Chinese shadow puppets are going to go see this strange ethnic folk dance called the Nutcracker Ballet, and what are their impressions. So I'm very excited to share that with everybody. It's just basically, again, our way of taking out the European point of view and looking at the Nutcracker with fresh eyes and saying, well, what are we actually doing here? So it's educational, it's lighthearted. There's a lot of terrible dad jokes, which Gina just rolls her eyes at nonstop. But yeah, it's a way for us to have a little bit of fun, but also teach people, you know, how to think about this stuff a little bit more critically.
Well, thank you again. And Gina, thank you. Your performances are always so wonderful at City Ballet and elsewhere. And I've enjoyed seeing little snippets of you rehearsing Sugar Plum, yes?
Yes.
Line?
Yes.
And I think you look gorgeous.
Oh,
Quite
thank
frankly.
you very, very much. I appreciate your kind words. They mean so much to a tired body right now who just danced Sugar Plum all day. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And I think there's more to come there. It might not happen on the State Theater stage. Oh wow, on the David H. Koch Theater stage. Wow, I am such a creature of habit. Um, I just aged myself. And
Uh,
and it's going to happen. And I think I've gone on and on about what Sugar Plum represents to me, and I think I'm going to further articulate that in the streaming that will happen, that we just so lovingly filmed today. And I'm so excited for you guys to see that. That's through Evergreen City Ballet. It was a gig that I was going to travel and dance. The pandemic changed that, so we filmed it in Queens all day long, and it was wonderful. I got to employ some Broadway friends of mine who have film mindsets, and that's also been a wonderful connector at this time. It's not all yes, we have lost so many lives, and we are struggling in our economy, but there's some good, I think, that's happening in the arts world right now. And I
mhm.
think it's thinking outside of the box. And I'm so happy that you were inspired by Phil's book. I can't wait to read Phil's next book. I've heard little snippets. It's wonderful. And I do hope that you will also read my book that is not related to our final bow work, but my own personal memoir that's coming out in fall 2021.
Oh, congratulations.
It'll be
What's it called?
very exciting. It's called Swan Dive, The Making
Uh-huh.
of a Rogue Ballerina. So
Good
yes,
choice.
I think inherently anything that I do is going to end up being political because look at me. Um, but it's a story. It's a wonderful love letter to ballet and to New York City. So I really hope you all will embark on reading that when it comes out, when it's time.
I believe that all art is political, and you can quote me.
Right.
The other thing I wanted to ask you about very briefly, the wonderful piece that you did with Justin Peck that was part of the digital programming done
Yes.
with City Ballet, is that still available online?
Yes, absolutely. If you go to New York City Ballet's YouTube page, I believe that it is still streaming there. It was a wonderful collaboration. I got to reunite with Jody Lee Lipes, who filmed New York Export Opus Jazz,
Mhm.
which is the original. That's where we first met each other. And then Justin had come to Rise. And what a wonderful, I call it the Opus Jazz Redux because it's
Uh-huh.
dancing in sneakers across the city, but with this newfound, Chris Thiele, he wrote such revamped a song that he'd already written for this time. And what an exciting experience it was to get, performing will not be a thing for me for a very long time. And
Mhm.
so I found that food, that fuel, and just me getting to unleash on the roof of the theater. And in the interview afterward, Jody says, like we wanted to put Gina as close to the theater because I feel like she would want to be there.
Mhm.
That, and it's true. It's just like, I want to be there. I want to give my gift, and if it happens to have to be on the roof of the theater, I'm going to do it. And I think that's wonderful about the artists during this time is that we're figuring out a way to make it work, whether it be like pods, quarantining out in Vermont, or we are making a way to perform, to give our gift, because it's just like Phil says, it's part of our being now.
Well, thank you, Georgina Pazcoguin and Phil Chan. And this is F. Paul Driscoll for Sightlines and Opera News. And join us next time.